I can't do it. Okay.
All right, now that we established that, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jamie Smithson and I'm with Belmont Village of Westlake Hills. Today's talk is being brought to you with a partnership with our sister community, Belmont Village of Lakeway. Between our two communities, we offer all levels of senior living between assisted, independent, and some very specialized memory care programs. For today's talk, we'll be using the chat feature. Everyone is going to be muted. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat box and we'll make sure that we get to it at the appropriate time. Today's speaker is Dr. Sherrie All. Dr. All is passionate about empowering people to use their brains brilliantly to live better, lead better, and love better. She's an international speaker, writer, licensed clinical neurorehabilitation psychologist, brain health expert, and the owner and director of the Chicago Center for Cognitive Wellness. Her forthcoming book, The Neuroscience of Memory, 7 Skills to Optimize Your Brain Power, Improve Memory, and Stay Sharp at Any Age, is due out in early 2021 and is the first in a series of neuroscience books that inspire purpose, leadership, and spectacular living. And today, Dr. All is going to walk us through what can be a tremendously scary time for a person and their family. The topic is what to do after getting the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So without further ado, Dr. All, I will let you take it away, and thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I love speaking for Belmont, and this is always a great venue. I grew up in Oklahoma, so being around Texans, after living in Illinois for almost 2 decades, I love, like, the accent makes me feel very, at home. So, all right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my slides, and thank you all for being here. So we're going to talk about helping patients and families respond to a diagnosis of memory loss. And what I hear a lot of times from folks in memory care is that a lot of times is somebody like Jamie is going to be the first person that a lot of families call, because you're kind of like, what do I do? What's happening? Maybe even, when people are starting to first kind of suspect that there are some cognitive changes. And so it's always helpful to kind of help families sort of navigate this process, because it's not easy. It can take a really long time to get an appointment, to get a diagnosis, and there's kind of a lot of peaks and valleys along the way. We're not going to talk a ton about diagnosis, but I did want to just kind of give you some high points, and then we'll kind of go through what is sort of like a David Letterman top 10 list. That's what I like to give you for this presentation, of sort of the top 10 what's next after a diagnosis. So, but let's just start with kind of some basics. That was a lovely introduction. We're probably not going to be able to help a ton of you, but I just wanted to give you a quick view of my team here in Chicago. We are some mental health providers. We do neurocognitive evaluations, and we do a lot of kind of this what's next sort of delivery service. So there we are, back when we could all be together. And so the thing is that, we're facing a major public health crisis in the United States, before and after COVID, God willing, that the prevalence of dementia is expected to triple in the next 30 years. And so why is that happening? We'll talk about that in just a second, but let's go through some of the numbers. So currently there are about 47 million people living with dementia worldwide. Within the United States, we're at about 5 million people and this is just for Alzheimer's disease. There are other forms of dementia. So I think kind of in total, we're at about maybe 5 or 6 million people with dementia. And we're expecting those numbers to triple in the next 30 years, so that by the year 2050, there will be about 13 million people living with Alzheimer's disease. Why is this happening? Why is this increase happening? So a lot of times people will say, well, it's because people are living longer, maybe our food supply isn't that great, we don't have the best lifestyle patterns, and all of those things are true, but those would indicate sort of a slow progression. This is a jump. This is a pretty big leap in cases, and the reason for this is actually a demographic issue, and it's because baby boomers are moving into that high risk category for dementia. So right now, every single day in the United States, 10,000 baby boomers turn 65. They've been doing it for a decade, and they're going to keep doing it for about another decade. We're kind of right in the middle of this thing. And what is the number one risk factor for dementia? Being over 65. So every single day we get, about 10,000 new candidates for kind of being in that high risk category. And, and these cognitive disorders are expensive, as I probably don't need to tell everyone that, but they're different than things like heart disease and cancer because a lot of money needs to go into kind of social costs. That there are social costs that come with cognitive disorders that don't always come with other chronic health conditions. And I mean, because in large part, a lot of people with cognitive disorders, can't live independently, and we have to either take away from working, the person themselves has to stop working in a lot of cases, or caregivers have to stop working, or we pay for caregiving. And so these are pretty costly disorders. Before the pandemic, Alzheimer's disease was the most expensive disorder, medical condition in the United States. COVID has kind of outpaced that. It's also now, COVID's now the third leading cause of death in the United States currently. But, we're hoping that that's sort of a short-term problem. And so, but, kind of anyway, so cognitive disorders are expensive. Alzheimer's disease, we're currently spending about $250 billion a year on Alzheimer's. If you add in stroke and traumatic brain injury, that puts us at about $300 billion to $400 billion a year. Like I said, only about 15% of the cost is direct medical cost. The rest of that, and a big chunk of that, 85%, is due to economic, family, social, indirect costs. And so just like the tripling of the incidence, we're expecting a tripling of the cost. And if current predictions hold, by the year 2050, we will be spending over $1 trillion a year on just Alzheimer's disease. And one of the harsh realities of this is that this will bankrupt the Medicare system if we don't do something about it. So something to think about as we're kind of debating healthcare in this country. I mean, one thing we could do about it is not just have people over 65 in the Medicare system. So let's talk about a few other things. So already between 1 and 8, anywhere between 1 and 5 to 1 and 8 adults over 65 have sort of this in-between diagnosis that we call mild cognitive impairment. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but it's sort of not quite dementia, but it's where you've sort of lost some cognitive skills a little bit faster than normal aging, but it's not necessarily dementia. And some of the other associated issues, which you may also be experiencing, is that people with cognitive decline don't go down in a vacuum. Caring for a person with cognitive decline can be remarkably stressful. And we know that there are increased rates of stress-related diseases in caregivers. And so this statistic comes from, if you're caring for anybody with a major chronic disease, your personal mortality risk is increased by about 63%. And I would argue that caring for a person with dementia may actually be more stressful than caring for somebody with diabetes or even maybe heart disease. Another side effect of cognitive decline is that social circles often dry up. When people stop working, they lose a lot of that kind of day-to-day socialization. It's a lot of the stress that we're experiencing throughout this pandemic, right? That, we're social primates where we thrive on being around other humans and kind of interacting, and there's a lot of positive effects of that. And so with or without a pandemic, dementia can be really isolating, not just for the person with dementia who's having trouble kind of keeping up with conversations. It makes it a little harder to hang out with your buddies. but also for care partners because the disease can be pretty isolating there too. And we know that social isolation itself is a mortality risk. So there are kind of these add-on issues that sort of come along with a diagnosis. Um, we're pretty good at taking care of people in the later stages. I mean, we can always do better. I think Belmont's doing a fabulous job, in my opinion. So in the later stages, if you need in-home care, you sort of know where to find that, on the internet. If you need long-term care, independent living, memory care, you sort of know where to look for that. But we don't have a lot of known services for the earlier stages. And there are services that exist. But there's sort of this like self-perpetuating cycle where people aren't getting early detection because they don't think there's much you can do about it in the earlier stages, which then leads to sort of a lack of a market for early intervention services. And so then it kind of perpetuates this perception that there's literally not much to do about it. So like, what am I going to do? Why do I want to know if I'm having some cognitive decline? Because what am I going to do? Right. So we are trying to just kind of shift the conversation around that and really move towards people getting early detection and early diagnosis, because there actually are a lot of interventions that we can do in the earlier stages. And that's where we can probably get the best return on investment for intervention services. What are those interventions? We'll talk about a few of those when we get to the top 10 here in a minute. But here's the thing, interventions matter, and they don't just matter from like, oh, that's nice, right? Like kind of, for what do you call it? Like a quality of life outcome. Interventions also have we expect the interventions are going to have a really significant economic impact too, because if we can delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease by just 5 years, the predictions are that we can cut that $1 trillion price tag in half. That's a lot. So instead of spending $1 trillion a year on Alzheimer's disease, we'll be spending, closer to what we have been, like about $500 billion, $600 billion a year. And, the American budget kind of needs that, right? Like, so, and I would add in not just prevention, but if we can catch people in the earlier stages of dementia, that's where we can kind of intervene and work to try to slow down some of the progression, because where things get really expensive is when people start to lose independence. And so if we can help people maintain their activities of daily living, their independent skills as long as possible, then that's where we're going to get a lot more of that kind of return on our investment. So early detection, early intervention, all very important. And so important that a couple of years ago, the Lancet commissions, they're a big review body out of the UK. They did a really comprehensive review of the kind of the full landscape of dementia prevention, intervention, and care. And they released this 60-page journal article. So I don't know if you've ever read a journal article, but it's like 6-point font. So it's like crammed with information, where they reviewed kind of everything that we could find out about, like, what are risk factors, what are best practices for intervention, what do we need to be doing to kind of help address this major public health crisis. And so they concluded a couple of things. Remember, this was before COVID, because this came out in 2017. So this probably isn't quite accurate anymore. But back in 2017, they did determine that dementia is the greatest global challenge for health and social care of the 21st century. Before COVID came along, this was our AIDS crisis. And, with any luck, will still be our AIDS crisis when we're done with COVID, and that acting now on dementia intervention, prevention, and care will vastly improve living and dying for individuals with dementia and their families, and in doing so will transform the future of society. Well, guess what? The future of society is transforming. We can't keep 10,000 baby boomers from turning 65 every single day. This senior tsunami is coming, and but what we can do is kind of what they're saying here is that if we jump in now, then we can really make an impact on if the changing the future of society goes in a positive direction or in, what could potentially be a really devastating direction. So it's good to kind of know what's next after a diagnosis of memory loss, because that way, we all kind of know what to do, and then we won't avoid getting interventions or early detection, and that will transform the future of society. So a couple of other things, we're going to kind of, hopefully we'll move out of the doom and gloom a little bit pretty quickly, but we're not quite there. But let's talk a little bit about the difference between dementia and normal age-related cognitive decline, because there is some confusion about that. And we're like, well, isn't it just, aren't people just getting older, get senile? So there is a difference. Dementia is not an inevitable consequence of old age. Getting older is the number one risk factor for developing dementia, but they're not the same thing. So I'm sure we all know people in their 90s who are sharp as a tack, right? So dementia is not an inevitable consequence of old age, but that's not to say that losing cognitive skills is not an inevitable part of getting older, because it kind of is. So with the exception of a couple of cognitive skills, things like your vocabulary, your wisdom, also we're learning maybe like emotion regulation, things like, this too shall pass and don't sweat the small stuff. Those are skills that continue to kind of develop and increase across the lifespan. But with the exception of those couple of cognitive skills, every other cognitive skill peaks at about 25 or 30 and is all downhill from there. So, I'm on the wrong side of this too. I sometimes when I'm in a group with people, I'll ask, is anybody here under 30? And then that one person will kind of raise their hand, and we're like, okay, well, we all kind of hate you right now, right? But that's okay. You can make it up to us later when you can help us get on the Wi-Fi later. So we're all getting a little slower. It's a little hard to kind of keep things in our mind and sort of mentally manipulate information. We are, we can still learn things, but it does take a few more repetitions. You might have to practice it a little bit more. And so there is normal age-related cognitive decline, but that's not the same as dementia. And so if this is the arc of kind of normal age-related cognitive decline, this is dementia. And that's really the definition of dementia, which is cognitive decline that's worse than normal aging and gets in your way. And that's really how we work to diagnose it. And the best practices are to do standardized cognitive testing. You really need to get an objective assessment of a person's cognition. Jamie, can you pop in and let me know if you guys are hearing me okay? I just got like a little message that said my internet was unstable.
You froze up there for a second, but you're like fine now.
Okay. Let me know if it does it again.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I kind of forgot where it was. All right. See, memory. I'm on this side of 30. All right, so that's how we diagnose it. So we do objective assessments, because you really can't diagnose this subjectively. You do need to get some quantification of a person's memory skills, either through a cognitive test at a doctor's office. The gold standard is neuropsychological testing, but we know that not everybody can kind of get to a neuropsychologist all the time, but you need to have some sort of an objective measure of cognitive decline, which is then compared to normal kind of age-related population norms. So we compare your score to a group of people of your similar age to see statistically, is this faster than normal aging? And then there's sort of the second functional component of that the cognitive problems get in your way, your ability to kind of take care of yourself. So, okay. So just real quick, I don't want to spend too much time here, but I do want to kind of touch on what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And so dementia is kind of this umbrella term. I like to kind of emphasize that it's really, dementia is not a disease, it's a syndrome, which is like a collection of symptoms, kind of like flu-like symptoms are a collection of symptoms. So, headache, fever, chills, body aches, but there are lots of things that can cause these flu symptoms. So dementia is the syndrome. It's the losing cognitive skills faster than normal aging in a way that gets in your way. But there are lots of things that can cause those symptoms. So Alzheimer's is a disease that causes those symptoms, but there are lots of other diseases that cause memory loss. You can have vascular damage. It can come from infections or even substance abuse, even traumatic brain injury. And so that's what we're kind of looking at here. That's sort of the major difference. Let me tell you just a little bit more about so we're actually not calling it dementia anymore. It's now called, in the DSM, which is the diagnostic taxonomy that we use for mental disorders in the United States. They've taken out the word dementia and replaced it with this word neurocognitive disorder. And there's two types of neurocognitive disorder. There's major neurocognitive disorder, which is that kind of most like the old dementia criteria, where you have a significant decline, it's worse than normal aging, and it gets in your way. But then there's also sort of this middle ground, this mild neurocognitive disorder, where people have more of kind of a modest decline. So like statistically, it's not significant impairment, but it's kind of a modest impairment. And they're still able to kind of take care of themselves. And I just want to I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I want to give you kind of a sense of what this is, because you may know people who have this diagnosis. I would gather that if you have a big group of friends of people over 65, that you probably do know somebody who has this, because we already know that between about 1 in 5 and 1 in 8 folks over 65 already have this diagnosis. And so what is it? It's that you've sort of lost some cognitive skills, a little bit, not terribly, but it is worse than normal aging. And you're having some trouble, but you're still able to kind of be independent. And so here's the thing. And this is, I think a lot of people really avoid getting a diagnosis of mild neurocognitive disorder. And I really want to change your mind about that, because it may or may not convert to major neurocognitive disorder. A lot of people avoid it because they're like, why would I want to know if I have like pre-Alzheimer's? I'm independent, everything's fine. But the thing is that it may not always be pre-Alzheimer's disease. It may or may not go on to be dementia. It may be that you kind of hang out in this phase of cognitive decline for a really long time. And a lot of our efforts are to actually keep you there. So what is it if it's not pre-Alzheimer's? So the Lancet commissions, they propose that it's probably best conceptualized as what we would call a probability state that can be used to identify a group that's sort of at higher risk for dementia. So sort of having your cognitive skills in this range can mean that you're at higher risk for dementia. It's more likely for you to kind of cross over to this kind of major category compared to if your scores were sort of in that average range still. But listen, it is not a death sentence, and your increased risk is relatively modest. It's not even 50-50 that you're going to go on to get dementia. Less than 40% of people with mild neurocognitive disorder go on to develop dementia within 3 to 10 years. So I really encourage people, if you're having some trouble, get some neuropsych testing. Let's hope you're fine. Let's hope you're in the average range and that everything's great and that's age-related cognitive decline. But even if you get this mild neurocognitive disorder diagnosis, it's not a death sentence. You're still more likely than not to not get dementia within 3 to 10 years. It does put you at increased risk though. And so it does kind of help us understand that you're a person who's maybe vulnerable to going on to develop dementia, because that 22 to 39%, that's compared to only about 3% without mild neurocognitive disorder. Only about 3% of those folks go on to get dementia within 3 to 10 years. And one of the main reasons to find out if you have this diagnosis is because we have treatment recommendations. There is stuff you can do about it. And so what do you do about it? Well, for one, we want to treat the whole person. We want to intervene with what we would call multimodal interventions, all really aimed at decreasing any kind of neuropathological damage. If you have hypertension, we want to make sure that's well controlled because that can damage your brain cells. If you have diabetes, we want to make sure that's well controlled because that can damage your brain cells. You know, if you're a smoker, quitting smoking can actually increase your odds that you won't move on to dementia, those sorts of things. And we also want to do some brain health interventions, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And so while we're also trying to protect your brain, we're also trying to also beef up your functioning, help you maximize your function. It could be making sure that you have really good routines around your activities of daily living. Maybe that you take on extra household duties to kind of help out your caregiver. You know, maybe you were never the laundry folder, but if you become the laundry folder, like that could really help later down the line, right? And so working to maximize function, maximize function through cognitive and social stimulation. We definitely want to treat depression and anxiety because those are known risk factors for dementia. And this may or may not surprise you, but the current recommendations are that we don't actually start people on memory medications in this diagnostic category. We wait until they've kind of moved on to that major neurocognitive disorder before kind of giving those memory medications. Okay, so I do want to open it up for questions because now we're going to shift into the top 10. So if you have any kind of burning diagnosis questions, can you chat those to Jamie and then she can sort of curate them for us? Nothing? All right. Okay, well then let's get into the what's next. What are we going to do? And like I said, I like to run this kind of like a David Letterman top 10. I know he hasn't been on for a while, but we're all old enough to remember David Letterman, right? So he would always have his top 10 list. All right, so number 10, it's okay to freak out if you get a diagnosis. It's okay. I mean, I think that a lot of people kind of pride themselves on being stoic and professional, but like, I got to tell you, like I've delivered these diagnoses quite a bit. I know, because I see it. I watch, the expression go blank. I know that when I'm giving feedback to a family and diagnosing memory loss, that, they'll hear the word dementia or Alzheimer's, and then it's sort of like Charlie Brown's teacher, right? Like, they don't really hear much of what I say after that point. It's kind of like, wah, 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 wah. So, I think we have a little bit of stuff going on in the chat. So Jamie, feel free to interrupt me if that's a question that seems I'm not going to read it, so it's okay to freak out. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be sad. And it's okay to go back and ask questions because it is incredibly normal to not really fully appreciate the feedback that you're getting whenever you get a diagnosis like this. And you're probably going to go home and then have 50 bajillion questions that like kind of pop into your mind. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be sad. It's okay. So that's number 10. Number 9.
Dr. All?
Yes.
There's one question from your last slide. It was asking, what is the main way to confirm diagnosis of Alzheimer's?
Oh, okay. So back to the diagnosis, like to hear. So what's the main way to confirm? So there's a lot of ways to do this. So number one, there's sort of two parts to this. So we have to diagnose the clinical syndrome of dementia, right? Like that's number one. So the best way to do that is actually the gold standard is through neuropsychological testing. So meeting with a neuropsychologist who gives kind of an array of tests, testing memory, visual spatial function, language, and puts that all together and kind of rules out other causes like maybe depression, stress, those sorts of things. That's the major or mild neurocognitive disorder. Remember the syndrome. Then there's sort of a second layer of that to try to figure out what is it due to, right? What's causing it? And then that's a little bit more of a medical question. And so a person is going to go through, so the neuropsych testing is just one component of a full dementia evaluation. That's just to measure the behavioral manifestations of what's going on in the brain. Then we need to figure out what's going on in the body and the brain that we think may be causing it. And so usually a dementia evaluation is going to include, in addition to the neuropsych testing, it'll include a blood test to rule out reversible causes. Vitamin deficiencies can cause dementia, or like symptoms can cause memory loss, especially like B12 deficiency, thyroid dysfunction. So there's a lot of like metabolic things that can be kind of diagnosed in the blood test that we want to kind of rule out. Then you will get an MRI of your brain that gives us kind of a snapshot of, is there any kind of atrophy? We can look for stroke activity. We can rule out a tumor, those sorts of things. And so that's number 2, pretty standard. And usually you'll probably meet with like a neurologist who will kind of do a little bit more of like a physical, kind of sensory motor neurological examination, kind of making sure that, are there any changes in like your field of view, your gait, the way your limbs are moving, your kind of your overall nervous system. And then there are sometimes some added on types of assessments that are becoming a little bit more mainstream. So there is a PET scan that is FDA approved that can show some of the beta amyloid plaques that are growing in the brain that we know are associated with Alzheimer's disease. There's also another PET scan that can show the other type of pathology, these tau tangles, but that's only available in research settings. It's not FDA approved yet. And also we can look for some of those biomarkers of the beta amyloid and the tau in the spinal fluid. So you might get a spinal tap that sort of adds to sort of the assessment of is it Alzheimer's, those sorts of things. Only about 40% of newly diagnosed cases in the United States are getting spinal taps, but I think they are starting to become a little bit more frequent. So that's sort of how it goes. Does that, chat me back if that didn't answer all your questions. Okay, so, all right, we freaked out. Then we're going to tell some people. I really encourage you to tell some people, because I think that, unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma with a lot of these diagnoses. You probably don't want to like post it on Facebook or like tell everybody in the world, but it is important to have some confidants and, tell some people that you trust, or maybe you tell a counselor, you tell Jamie, right? But start to kind of build your life team around this, because like we said earlier, it can be pretty isolating. And so I did want to give you a couple of resources. So if you hadn't heard about memory cafes, this is a really great grassroots effort that's happening in the United States. These are aimed at being fun, social gatherings for people living with dementia and their families. So they're a little different than a support group, because support groups are great. We need those. I encourage you to find a support group. But support groups are, really geared in a large part towards the grief of whatever, you're getting support for. But there's room for a lot of other feelings when you're living with dementia. And so memory cafes are really geared more towards sort of the fun side of so meeting new friends, increasing your social support, connecting with resources in your community, because there may be all sorts of cool things out there for people with dementia to do. Chicago, we've got like a lot of stuff going on. We've got choirs, for people, we call it like the memory singers, so it's a choir full of people with dementia. We've got special docents who can kind of take you around the art museums, who are trained to work with people with dementia. And you may not know about any of those things. And so memory cafes can kind of give you an inroad to that, because, you'll sit down and you'll talk to another family with dementia and they'll be like, oh yeah, well, we went to this yesterday and we were going to this program. And so that's really good. And I really like to normalize this, because you may need to make new friends after you get a diagnosis of memory loss. And because again, it can be a little hard to sort of keep up with your old buddies if maybe you're asking the same question over and over, or you're just kind of not able to keep up with current events. And so, but that's kind of normal. You know, you think about your whole lifespan, like you have your high school friends, you got your college friends, you got your like 20 something beer drinking friends, you got your parent friends, then you have your dementia friends, right? Like it's kind of part of normal part of life. Speaking of dementia friends, I also want to tell you about this. This is actually a government initiative called Dementia Friendly America. And so knowing that the prevalence is about to triple, communities, states, counties, municipalities are starting to put together what they're calling these dementia friendly communities. And so like, here's an example of like dementia friendly Arlington, Virginia. So like the city of Arlington, Virginia has kind of put together this like training program for the public. So training bank tellers, bus drivers, store clerks, you know, like this is what dementia is. And, you know, are you, you know, if you see somebody with dementia, what are you going to do? Are you going to ignore them, or might you lend a helping hand and sort of helping the community learn to start to respond to this? Because again, you know, we're expecting the prevalence to be much, much higher. Okay. So number 9 is tell somebody. My number 8 is to get involved in clinical trials. And so, because this can actually be a really amazing way to get access to cutting edge diagnostic and intervention resources. And so one really easy way to look for clinical trials is that the Alzheimer's Association runs a really cool trial match service. You know, so you sign up for this database. They're not going to sell your email to Pfizer. So you're not going to get blasted with a bunch of emails. I mean, they're very respectful about this. But if you're in this database and then a new clinical trial opens up near you that it looks like you might be a good match for, then you know, they'll let you know, and then you have the opportunity to sign up for that trial. The pace of research for Alzheimer's disease is really starting to pick up. We're starting to actually allocate, you know, adequate amounts of money for research. Now that we can see some of this Alzheimer's pathology in the brain with these new PET scans and these spinal fluid tests, that we don't have to wait until people die to see if an intervention is effective. And so there are a lot of new clinical trials that are starting up that may be available. Also, you know, this is a way to get some of those PET scans for free. Even though the beta amyloid test is FDA approved, insurance does not cover it yet. And so if you want one, you may have to pay like $3,000 to $5,000 out of pocket. But if you get into the right clinical trial, you might get one for free. And depending on the trial, they'll tell you, you know, the results. And most of them do kind of give you the results back. But okay, so that's my number 3. I would definitely get involved in clinical trials because there's just a lot of stuff going on. Number 7 is to work to optimize your brain health. So back when we looked at like the mild neurocognitive disorder, that the stuff you can do about it, you know, we really need to work on helping people maintain as many brain cells as you can, decreasing neuropathological damage, holding onto your brain cells, because this really matters. So about 20 years ago, a neuropsychologist named Yakov Stern looked at a bunch of data that we were getting from people with dementia, and looking at some of the data for people with Alzheimer's disease, and some of these autopsy studies where people would go in and kind of count the amount of beta amyloid growing in a brain, and that didn't actually always predict how well a person was doing cognitively. What actually did seem to predict whether or not a person was showing clinical signs of dementia was actually how big their brain was, how much brain cells they had left over. And so he proposed this theory of cognitive reserve, which really kind of summarizes a lot of evidence that we've seen, is that if people have more brain cells stored in their brain bank, then they have more to lose before crossing over this dementia threshold. And so I call it your brain's 401k account because it is quite literally like your brain's retirement account. So the more brain cells you have, the more you have to lose before kind of crossing over this threshold. And so this is kind of why we want to know if a person has mild neurocognitive disorder and then work to kind of protect their brain health. But brain 401k investing can kind of go two different ways. So we definitely want to protect the brain cells you've had all your life, but we also now know that you can actively invest in your brain 401k throughout your life. And because now we're learning a lot more about neuroplasticity, that the adult brain continues to kind of grow and change throughout the lifespan. And so I have there are lots of ways to maximize your brain 401k investing, but I'm just going to give you my top 3. I do have a whole topic on this, so we could spend a whole hour. We could actually spend days on this, but let me just give you my top 3. So number 1 is I want you to be more physically active. That's probably the number 1 best way that you can improve your brain health. And intellectual engagement, and then also managing your stress. So let's dig into each of these just a little bit. So early in the days when we started learning about cognitive reserve, we noticed that people who were physically active had bigger amounts of reserve. We thought, well, why is that? Is it just because, what's good for your heart is good for your brain? And that is true. So having a healthy heart is a prerequisite for having a healthy brain. But we've also learned some direct impact of physical activity on the brain, in addition to kind of what's going on in the vasculature. So for one, when you're more physically active, you're actually growing more blood vessels in your brain, so that you can maybe if you have a little bit of a stroke activity, then you have a little bit more of a backdoor to kind of keep your brain cells alive. We also know that when you're physically active, you grow more brain cells. Adults grow new brain cells. If you didn't know that, then just lock that away. We grow new brain cells. You don't grow a lot, so you got to keep the ones you have. You're not growing them all over your brain, but they do grow in sort of the memory parts of your brain, which seems to be really important. And people who are physically active grow more brain cells. So like I said, you're not going to be replacing all of these brain cells that maybe are affected by your memory loss, but it's going to give you a much better buffer if you're physically active, because you are growing more brain cells than if you're not physically active. And in addition to growing more brain cells, your brain produces these chemicals called nerve growth factors that are kind of like Miracle-Gro for your brain cells, that help the brain cells you've had your whole life kind of rewire and kind of compensate for any kind of skills that you may be having some changes. And we're watching brains grow as a result of being more physically active. And so this study took a group of ladies in their 60s and randomly assigned them to 2 different exercise conditions. One was a stretching and toning group, and the other was a kind of a vigorous walking group. And they measured their brains at the beginning, at 6 months, and at 1 year. And in the stretching and toning group, this little part of the brain, the hippocampus, this is where these new brain cells grow, and it's the part that's responsible for your memory. In the stretching and toning group, the hippocampus shrunk by about 1.5%, which wasn't because of the stretching. It's actually kind of the normal age-related amount of shrinkage for a person in their 60s. But the group that did the vigorous walking, their hippocampus actually grew by about 2%. And so these authors concluded that being more physically active literally reverses 1 to 2 years of age-related volume loss. So I don't know about you, but if I'm up late watching some infomercial about, like, I don't know, the greatest, like the latest supplement for your brain, which, by the way, don't buy any supplements. Like, none of them have really been tested or proven. But like Prevagen or whatever, but if they made this claim, reverses 1 to 2 years of age-related volume loss, then I'd be like, whoa, that's really interesting. But I'm also a trained skeptic, so I'm gonna be like, I'm not really sure. But we have this data, and you don't have to spend $80 a month on some questionable supplement. Maybe you just need to buy a new pair of sneakers. So, okay, so move your body. Number 2, you need to learn something new, because those baby brain cells, whenever you when you first pop those out, like after your walk, they don't actually start off as new neurons. They start off as stem cells. And in order to grow up to be a new neuron, they have to be given a job, which means, and the way they're, the way that, cells get jobs is to be stimulated by neighboring cells, which means that you need to be activating your learning and memory parts of your brain. So you need to stimulate those new stem cells so that they grow up to be a new neuron and they stick around. If they're not stimulated by your memory centers, then they are just reabsorbed by the system, which is just a nice way of saying that they die. So if you want those baby brain cells to stick around, learn something new, and if you also want them to stick around, you need to manage your stress, because we know that high levels of the stress hormone cortisol keeps you from growing new brain cells. And it's also related to shrinkage of the hippocampus. And so the thing is, you can't get rid of all your stress, nor should you. We're not really meant to do that. We're really meant to kind of be in sort of this natural flow between kind of that fight or flight response that you get when you're kind of revved up, excited and nervous about something, and then sort of this rest and digest state. And so zebras don't get ulcers, right? Because they have sort of this nice flow, they're hanging out, eating grass. They see a predator, they run away. But humans and other social primates, here's where we get ourselves in trouble, is that we can activate our fight or flight purely with our thoughts. And so far too many of us kind of get stuck in this state of like constant production of cortisol in our brains that keeps us from being able to grow new brain cells. It's kind of killing off the ones we've had. So we do need to work on some relaxation strategies to kind of restore this balance, right? To get our bodies out of fight or flight, back into rest and digest. So using meditation apps, those sorts of things. Okay, so that's number 7. Oh, we've got quite a bit to go. Okay, number 6, talking the talk. So these are just some communication strategies that are really helpful to learn. The types of communication challenges that can happen with cognitive decline can really vary. In the earlier stages, they can be really mild, but later on, there can be a lot of, communication challenges to the point where people kind of can't remember names. Maybe they rely on gestures, nonverbal communication, touch, those sorts of things. And so what I really want to encourage you to do is to start being aware of communication kind of after you get a diagnosis, and really look to the person with dementia to guide you in how they want you to handle communication changes. Things like if they're struggling to find a word, what do they want you to do? Do they want you to wait patiently until they kind of come up with the word? Do they want you to help them out and kind of fill it in for them? In the earlier stages, a lot of SLP, speech language pathologists, will recommend letting the person kind of take the time to sort of struggle, because it kind of keeps those neural pathways like active. Maybe we don't want to compensate too early, but also just, when we get early diagnosis, we have the ability to kind of consult with the person with dementia about, how do they want us to handle it? What feels best? Those sorts of things. Later on, then you may have to start guessing and those sorts of things. It's really important to get some training on how to avoid arguments, power struggles. That can be a real issue. People with dementia are grown-ups, spent most of their lives making choices for themselves. And so it can be really, really hard to go back to people telling you what to do. And so, but the thing to emphasize is that whose job is it to get out of a power struggle? It is the person with intact cognition's job to end the power struggle. It's not fair to kind of expect the person with dementia to be the one to end a power struggle. And so learning some really good techniques. Yes, and is from improv. That's improv. So in improv acting, the rule is that you can never say no, because it kind of kills the scene. And so if you ever want to say no, then you just say yes, and I'm going to sit here and watch TV. Yes, and we're going to go to the doctor's office later. here are some things to never ever say though. Here's some don'ts. Never infantilize. Again, we're working with grownups. And never engage in a power struggle, and really try to eliminate the word remember from your vocabulary. It's not fair, because if you have a memory problem, chances are you may or may not remember. And this word is often unnecessary and often just kind of highlights the problem, and can make a person with dementia feel really anxious and ashamed in a lot of cases. So a lot of times we just kind of tack it onto the end of the sentence. So kind of training ourselves to sort of end the sentence. It's like, when did we go to the doctor? Oh, we just went to the doctor. Instead of saying, oh, we just went to the doctor, remember? You could say, oh, we just went to the doctor and we had a great time, right? Okay. All right, we're halfway through. Number 5, is there a pill for that? So there are 5 approved medications to improve cognition. These are things that a doctor would prescribe. 3 of them are these cholinesterase inhibitors like Aricept. They kind of boost this chemical acetylcholine that kind of helps the memory centers work better. They're really only good for like Alzheimer's or Lewy body. They're not recommended for vascular dementia anymore. The 4th kind is this one, Namenda, that sort of an add-on. There is a 5th drug now that's this Namzaric, that's sort of a combination of Aricept and Namenda. So again, but we don't have any disease modifying medications, nothing to kind of stop the plaques and tangles from growing in the brain. Hopefully we will get some of those approved soon. There are several that are in phase 3 clinical trials right now. But right now we're really more just kind of dealing with the symptoms. I would recommend also physical activity can also boost cognition. And so maybe that's, exercise as medicine could be another kind of nice intervention. All right, number 4, get your affairs in order. I don't have a ton of details here, but it can be elder law attorneys can be worth their fee many-fold over in terms of protecting assets, estate planning, those sorts of things. There are a couple of different categories of kind of legal things that can happen. There's sort of a group of things like a living will and a durable power of attorney. Those are things that you kind of want to put in writing ahead of time to sort of lay out your care. The other side of things are things like decisional capacity, competency, and guardianship. Those are more for like if people are kind of concerned about you making choices for yourself and they want to be able to kind of take over that authority because maybe they think you're not making the best choices for yourself. And so it's really helpful to just try to look for any kind of resources you can. The Alzheimer's Association has a really great care navigation service. You could just call their 24-hour helpline and say, I want to know about care planning. And so kind of depending on the area, I imagine in the Austin area, they probably have some of these care planners. They give you like a free service where you can kind of figure some of this stuff out. But definitely start thinking about the financial and legal side of this. It's really important to do in the early days. All right, number 3 is the safety dance, right? Like, was that the 80s song? You can dance if you want to. So the safety dance is, when do you start to take away some responsibilities like the keys or, being alone or using the stove and those sorts of things. And this is a really tough thing. I mean, I would say probably more often than not, people wait probably a little too long to start to take away some things, particularly driving. I really recommend what we call the grandchild test. So we ask families, would you let this person drive your grandkids around or your children around? And they say, yes or no. Okay. And we're like, no, but they're not doing that. They're just driving around in the corner to the store. Okay, but my kids are out there. My grandkids are out there. So if you won't let your kids or grandkids ride in the car, they shouldn't be driving. So let's figure out a way to kind of pull back this. Because I mean, it's a profound safety concern. You would just really hate for somebody to cause a death. That's devastating. So but I have seen it kind of go the other way too, where sometimes families will kind of overcorrect a little too early, maybe. So it is really helpful it's important to just get some help on a lot of this stuff so that you can kind of make these decisions. Be really candid with doctors, maybe pull in a social worker, a counselor, a geriatric care manager, lots of different resources for kind of helping make a lot of these decisions. Number two is that there is a wealth of care options available. So, caregiving is different for a lot of different cultural groups within the United States. Kind of mainstream white culture tends to maybe not want to do a lot of that service themselves. Adult kids will kind of move away and maybe feel resentful a lot of times for having to jump in, and so might be more apt to kind of pay for long-term care. Other communities of color may actually see that more as like kind of a normal part of the aging process, or the expectation. You're like, oh, of course I'm going to take care of my mom. And a lot of times they have lower rates of caregiver burnout, caregiver stress. But there is, as you probably have already seen, because you're already connected with Belmont Village, that there's a whole wealth of care options, from in-home care, adult day centers, which are, a little harder to find in this pandemic, to, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing. And so it's really important, just, as soon as you can, start to kind of maybe get a lay of the land. There are lots of geriatric care managers that will help, kind of connect people with different communities to help find the right match. There's lots of locator services, like A Place for Mom is kind of a big national one, but there's some other ones that maybe are a little bit more curated. And so there's lots of ways to kind of get help with a lot of these. Okay, and then my number one recommendation is to live. There can be a lot of life after a diagnosis. There is gonna be a lot of life after the diagnosis. Regardless, even if it's a pretty rapidly progressing type of dementia, where, the life expectancy is maybe only a couple of years, that's still a lot of life. But with things like Alzheimer's, the average length of time between diagnosis and death is about 8 to 10 years. And most people are still only getting diagnosed in the moderate stages. So if we're doing early stage detection, that could be 2 full decades of life after a diagnosis of some memory loss. And so you can't just stop living, like, live. So you might wonder what PLWDs is. I learned this on Twitter. It's sort of the Twitter handle for people living with dementia. So it's person-centered language, living people first, right? And we're living with dementia, not dying from. And so it's just really important to remember to engage with life. Maybe you start checking off the bucket list. That's a real benefit of early detection, early diagnosis. Maybe you can still work in some of those vacations that you always wanted to do. But even if maybe it's a little too late for that, then, don't forget to live. Okay, so, all right, so that's it. If you want to know more about my book when it comes out next year, shoot me an email and say, put me on your email list. I, like the Alzheimer's Association, am not going to sell your email address to, I don't know, Pfizer or whoever. I'm just going to keep it safe. And then when the book launches in early 2021, then you'll find out. The book is called The Neuroscience of Memory: 7 Skills to Optimize Your Brain Power, Improve Memory, and Stay Sharp at Any Age. I talk a lot about cognitive reserve and neuroplasticity in that book. So if that's interest to you, then let me know. All right, do we have any more questions?
Dr. All, we did have someone chat in when you were kind of talking about your number one rule about living. If
Okay.
there were any dementia or Alzheimer's friendly resorts or cruises or things to that effect. Have you heard of any of that stuff coming about?
Yes. So I think the industry term is called dementia friendly, and there are definitely dementia friendly cruises. There may be some dementia friendly, like, tours that are happening. I haven't heard of any specific ones, but I do know there's a travel agent here in Chicago that does dementia-friendly cruises. And then, maybe some of the, I think it would be hard to believe that some of the like Arizona type resorts aren't having some sort of intervention like that. But yeah, that's what you want to be on the lookout for. If you email me, I will dig out the woman here in Chicago who's doing the dementia friendly cruises, and I can connect you with that person. But yeah, more and more. We here in Chicago, we've done sort of a day long like river cruise that's dementia friendly. So lots of opportunity. And I think that's going to keep happening more and more. Yeah, great question.
Well, thank you so much. We don't, they asked if you could put up that last slide one more time.
My email. There you go. All right.
Well, thank you so much for being with us again today. You always come with such great information. And for everyone, we'll definitely be scheduling another talk with Dr. All in the near future. And just so that everyone knows, our next talk, and this talk was a great segue to it, Dr. Chris Johnson with Texas State University, who spoke a couple months ago, is going to do a talk about dementia care around the world. So Dr. All, you spoke how we have about 6,000 people that have dementia here in the US. How are the other 50 some million cared for in other cultures and other systems? So that talk is going to be on September 17th. So everyone be on the lookout for that invite. But again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And Dr. All, as always, I really appreciate your time and your expertise. I love watching you talk because you're clearly just so passionate about what you do. So I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks,
all right, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.